Now, Eve, I want you to see this because for some reason, the last time I thought I was recording, I wasn't. Now, it says you're recording, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is 1 o'clock, and I want to be respectful of your time today. My name is Steve Carney. I'm the Chief of Districts and Schools at the department. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Sam Piercy, who is our Deputy Commissioner, and Trudy Hughes, who is the Chief of Staff in the Office of Districts and Schools. We are grateful to have you here today, especially knowing that it doesn't get any busier than where we are right now in the school year sometimes. Maybe at the end, but right now, it's certainly a very busy time.
Point it towards it.
Okay. As we get started, I will share the statement that has been shared in all of our engagement sessions on this topic. And I'll read that to you now. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BDP funding formula. The current BDP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. So got my disclaimer, check, have that out of the way. So here's how we're going to spend our couple of hours today together. We're going to walk through, we've done the first one, but I'll spend a couple of minutes just framing us, and then we're going to transition, and Sam is going to provide a couple of pieces of information to help ground the conversation. Everything from kind of the conversations that are happening currently with the 18 subcommittees and the public feedback, kind of just to let you all know where things are to date. But I will also note that the comment period is not closed, and so that is certainly just a snapshot in time. More we anticipate and hope to continue to receive comment. He will then spend a little time providing that foundational information on the local funding overview, which is how we will direct the majority of our time today. Certainly, there's a lot happening in the school funding discussion as it relates to the 18 subcommittees developing the new formula. Our focus today will hone in on that state and local contribution and how that split could and should look going forward. The majority of our time will be hearing from you, working in groups, working with the groups that you've brought today. And I will say this, Sam and I have been doing this week. Let's see, Tuesday, Jackson, Martin, Wednesday, Cookville, Cleveland, Thursday, Johnson City, Knoxville, this morning, Pulaski. Last but not least, here we are in Dixon, and I'm happy it's Friday. But we will get through, and what I can say about every one of those conversations, having this group's feedback on this targeted discussion has been incredible. Having folks that touch funding, whether you're in the superintendent seat, the CFO, the commission, school board chair, others, that is a perspective that oftentimes we don't get in the same room. And so superintendents hear certain things, CFOs hear different things. So it has been truly a helpful conversation, and we are looking forward to what that will yield today in our time. So what we will do, we'll spend the majority of the time working in groups, hearing from you. We will share that feedback out, and we will all attempt to capture that as well. And then at the end, of course, wrapping up with question and answer if time allows. So I do want to just also ground us with who is in the room. I think it's important to know what districts are here and the voices that are represented. Tess, may I start with you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Tess Stovall. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission, and I have our Director of Finance and Operations here, Marilyn Carroll.
Hi, I'm Barry Allen, is the organization of school superintendent.
Chris Williams, Stewart County Schools.
James Bridges, Houston County Mayor.
Hi, I'm Amy Bryant. I'm the school board chair. Michelle Gilbert, Director of Schools, Denton County.
Mike Elkins, Business Operations Officer in County.
Heidi, bookkeeper, Helms.
Robert Harmon, Assistant Director, Helms County.
Jesse Wallace, Nutley County Mayor. Bill Sproul, I'm Director of Work County Schools.
Nick Boger, ES Finance Director.
Lynn Frazier, Dixon County Schools Finance Director.
Chris Reynolds, Finance Officer, Clarkson County. Jeff Lane, the Finance Director for Montgomery County Government.
Angela Huff, Montgomery County School System Director.
Annette Stafford, 20th District County Commissioner, Education Chair, Houston County.
Berkeley Board, Sheriff Dixon County School Board.
Mike Smith, Little County Schools contractor. Jeff Fletcher, Wilson County Schools director.
See you.
Mark Gill, Houston County Schools.
Christmas High School Director, Houston County Schools.
Alex Spurgeon, Chair of Budget Committee, Houston County.
Jeff Mattis, Houston County School Board Chair.
Billy Vogel, Ross County Mayor.
Chris Dawson, Director of Schools, Robertson County.
Stephen Mother, I have to work with Ross. I'm Logan Ross, that's the board chair.
Gary Clark, King County Mayor.
Nancy Garrett, Houston County School Board Chair. Rachel Farmer, Finance Director. That's it.
Adrian Bauer, Director of Schools, Metro National Public Schools.
Freedom Player, Budget Chair, Metro County Schools.
Christian Bowman, Metro National Public School Board Chair.
Chris Henson, CFO, Metro National Schools.
And Trustee Crawford, Chief of Staff, Department of Education. Dr. Weeks.
Hi, Dan Weeks, Director of Schools here in Dixon County. Welcome you to Dixon today. Bob Brown, Dixon County Mayor. Welcome to Dixon County.
So thank you all again for being here, and I think as you look around the room, we certainly have a good assortment of roles and points of view that will inform this conversation. And it was really for that purpose why we chose to have this group convened here today. We certainly know that there's a great deal of work happening in those subcommittees, but what we know is that to have this state and local contribution conversation, that conversation cannot happen and should not happen without your input. Knowing that you all bring and you all play a role in the funding, especially that local contribution and that state and local contribution share. So again, I thank you for being here and look forward to the conversation. One of the things that we always make sure we do is think about how this work informs the goals and of the department. Of course, supporting and making sure every student has access to a high quality education, access to highly effective teachers, and the additional supports to be college and career ready. None of that happens without the work that you do every day. It's work that I get to work on, it's work that Sam gets to lead in the department, but truly none of that happens without the work that this group does. And so we're grateful for your interest and your ability to be here today with us to tackle this very, very important topic that we're going to tackle. With that, I'm going to hand off to Sam so we can leave as much time as possible for discussion.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you said, my name is Sam Piercy. I serve as the Deputy Commissioner of Operations at the department. I want to start by just reiterating our sincere thanks for you being here. Those of you who are on the school district side, you work very hard on behalf of kids every day. I know it's no small feat to take a step out of your districts to come spend time here to do that, have this conversation with us. For our local officials, you've got some people who are working really hard on behalf of kids in their communities, and we're grateful for their work. And to you, we also say thank you, because you have continued to show your investment in education, both financially and in other ways, to your communities for many years. And we really want this to be an opportunity for you to continue to discuss what that can look like moving forward. I also would be remiss if I did not say that Mary Ann Dursky sends her best. For those of you who are directors of schools and finance, you will know she is one of our school funding gurus. She has had some recent surgeries, so is not out on the road with us, but certainly has been on the phone with me all the miles across Tennessee this morning. What I'd like to do is start by giving a bit of a framing here. So when we talk about education finance, a lot of people talk about this piece over here of building the formula. So for the metaphor that doesn't go away when we talk about ed finance, it's about building the pie. What components go in? What should we fund? How do we think about the relative dollar figures associated with that? That is all building out a formula with the goal of saying how much money should go into funding our public education system. Fast forward to over here, the second part of that conversation is how do we think about the shared fiscal responsibility between the state and local communities to make that pie happen, right? So these are two parts of a broader conversation, but I want to take a moment to differentiate those. This part about how the shared fiscal responsibility plays out is something that has always been true of education in Tennessee. It has been a shared fiscal responsibility between the state and communities. What that looks like is what we're here to discuss today. What I want to acknowledge on the front end, and please just hear me say this right out of the gate, it is difficult, if not impossible, to have a conversation about what local versus state contributions should be without having actual numbers in front of you. We know that. We know you can't commit your community to a number that you don't know what it actually is. We're not going to ask you to do that today. We're going to ask you to help inform what should that discussion look like when that time comes. So we'll discuss that a little bit more as we get into it. So I'm going to ask a little bit of grace. I'm going to give the foundational piece of how this conversation about the funding formula is going, a snapshot in time, to really root everyone in the same foundation of this is what we're talking about right now. And then we're going to do that thing you should do in presentations and hard pivot to this local contribution piece, which is what everyone in this room touches. What does that local dollar look like that goes into your schools? So what is happening about this conversation regarding school finance in Tennessee? The biggest part of it is a shift from a resource-based model to a student-based model. A lot of people have asked questions. What does that mean? What does it look like? What is the difference in the framing? We're going to get in a few examples. Right now we have a formula, the Basic Education Program, or the BEP, that generates dollars for resources. So you have 20 kindergarten students, you get one teacher, and the formula funds that one teacher, the resource being the teacher. You have a special ed student who has speech therapy. They generate 1/85th of a special education teacher. That's what it's looking at, funding that teacher. A student-based model tries to pivot that and say, let's actually look at what speech therapy costs to offer to a special ed student. What can we fund in that realm? And bringing the link between the student need and the funding closer together, right? So still trying to get at the same purpose, but drawing a link tighter between the student and the dollar that's coming in. Technology is another good example. For those of you familiar with the BEP, you'll know that there's a $40 million pot that goes in for technology. It is funding the resource that is technology. I don't know a tech director in the state who hasn't asked questions about, thanks for all that one-time federal relief money, but what do I do when I need to refresh all of the devices in my district? Right? That's the difference. A student-based model might ask, how do we think about funding kids' technology needs? How do we keep a recent and frequently updated device in their hand? How do we think about connectivity? And really looking at it from that student need lens. This has been shared before, but throwing in District of Columbia and the 5 states who are doing a hybrid model, you're talking about 39 states who are currently using some version of a student-based model. It's all to say this isn't a new conversation in the national landscape. What does that actually look like? So I know this is super small, so I also want to note that we will share this deck out afterwards. So if you can't see it, that's all right. A student-based model has a base level of funding, that bottom of the pyramid, right? That is $1 figure for any student in the state, no matter where they live, what unique characteristics they may have or unique traits about their environment. It's about one level of funding that can cover the core education needs of the student. Then we look at that next tier, about weights. What unique attributes about a student or their environment may warrant consideration for additional funding? We mentioned special education earlier. Right, we'll go over a few other examples, but the idea is to say, we know not every student need can be covered with $1 figure. How do we look at that differently? Direct funding. These are dollars going to specific targeted programs for students. So think about your AP class offerings or dual course credits, right? Or think about the ACT retake, right? An exact dollar figure that can be tied to an exact student need. And then outcomes. What might it look like to incentivize when districts perform really well for their kids? And how can we reward that in a funding system? These 4 bullets at the bottom are what I want to spend a little time on. And we mentioned this at the beginning, but I'm just going to reiterate it. This is just a snapshot in time. The public comment is still open and ongoing. The subcommittees, 18 of them representing different student interests and different lenses on education, are still meeting. So please do not take this as a final thing, it's just where the conversation stands today. First, requests that we hear most frequently. Districts should not receive less state funding than they receive through the current BEP. We need more money for kids, right? That is not a new request, and we hear it loud and clear, first thing out of everyone's mouth when they're advocating for students. Second, maintain flexibility for local district budgeting. For those of you familiar with the BEP, you will have heard it said, the BEP is a funding plan, not a spending plan. This conversation has not talked about shifting that. right? It still leaves the dollars in the hands of local districts to make the best decisions for their students. Ensure that whatever is currently funded outside the BEP is included in a new formula. I'm going to parse this apart a little bit. Setting aside federal grants, the state funds certain grant programs in almost all districts in the state outside of the funding formula. Those are things like coordinated school health, school safety. For those of you who are outside of the school district, let me give you a sense of what that entails for the finance directors in the room. They have to write an additional budget for that. They have to file a plan for it. They have to submit reimbursements on it. It's a heavy administrative load. So there's conversation about taking those and putting them into the formula. Here's what that would be. The legal requirements that go along with school safety do not disappear. You still must have emergency operation plans for your school. You still must do drill logs. But instead of having a dollar tied to supporting that specific need, those dollars go into the funding formula in a flexible way, and you decide how to meet those requirements best in your local communities, right? One of the things that I also want to go ahead and just address out of the gate, because we've heard the concern. This isn't about taking the money from those programs and putting them in the formula and saying, yay, we put more money towards kids, right? It's not about that kind of shit. There'd be complete transparency about which grant programs move in, right? I just want to make that out of the gate. The last one up here is what we're here to discuss today. The local match component should be stable, what it would be under the BEP for 3 to 5 years. So again, coming back to this point of we can't have real conversations about what a different, if any difference, a local versus state cost sharing model could look like until we have real numbers. And we don't have those today. Right? I know it's been asked and pushed that there is a formula in someone's desk at the state level just waiting to be brought out. As the guy who is over those teams, I assure you there is not. It is being built with the input that is coming out of the subcommittees. So until we have those numbers, we can't ask you to weigh in on what the local contribution, that calculation should look like. I want to give you a little bit of more, context on some of the items that have been discussed to date in each of those layers of the pyramid. In the base, for those of you who have been involved and followed our BEP review committee over the last 15 years, these items are going to look familiar. Right? Nurses at every school or at the nationally recommended ratio. Same for counselors and school psychologists. Teacher salaries continues to be a priority, and benefits, right? A big push on the benefit side. A principal at every school building. And as an operations guy, one close to my heart, flexibility for facility funding and or deferred maintenance. We have a lot of aging school buildings in this state, and it costs money to keep them in a place where we can have students come into them each day. On the weights, a few of our usual suspects up here, and then some new things that we had not heard before, but we're excited here coming out of public comment in the subcommittees. Economically disadvantaged, so this covers families, students that are in families supported by TANF or SNAP benefits, but also concentration of poverty. So what might it look like to consider the multiplier effect that happens when you have a lot of students in a single school who are living in poverty? Think about the difference between your Title I schools and your non-Title I schools. Students with disabilities, English learners have continued to be popular topics. Rural, we knew was going to be a big one, but we didn't know sparsity, right? And this came up with the difference in saying there are rural communities where all the schools are really clustered together around a small town, and there are rural communities that have 60 miles in between the school buildings. To consider. And then we continue to hear a lot about fast growing and charter enrollment. What might it look like to consider are those items? Some reflections on things we expected to hear that we have not heard as much about thus far. Dyslexia, gifted students, dyslexia, small LEA size, so thinking about the challenges on economies of scale for our smaller LEAs, and K2 small class size weight. I can't tell you how much Eve and I have heard across the state this week that with the pandemic, our early learners are in a totally different place than they ever have been before. They have missed certain developmental pieces that just are creating a different environment. What might it look like to support that at the local level? Some of the additional dollar items that have received a lot of feedback positively. Financial literacy, middle school CTE. For those of you who work with our federal Perkins grant, you'll know that it recently was extended down to middle school grades to support CTE. What might it look like to have additional investment on that end in our formula? Innovative High School Models was a grant program that the state launched out of our federal relief funds at the state level. It's been immensely popular. What might it look like to make an investment to continue that? Extended school year. This is focused a lot around the summer programming that has happened and how do we continue something in that space. RTI, this has also come up a lot. You know, right now our funding formula looks at that as a district level, a system approach, but RTI, thinking about it more as the program that happens in a school building and what it looks like to support that, and high dosage tutoring. Some of the outcomes that have gotten a lot of feedback to date, positively: early post-secondary opportunities, AP course completion, industry certs, work-based learning. You'll notice the theme there, a lot of it is based on post-secondary readiness and workforce readiness. We've also heard about closing gaps for subgroups and some of the more traditional achievement outcomes that you know are important in the education space. All right, so now I'm going to do that pivot I talked about and shift more into the local contribution phase. Before I do that, what I want to make sure that I just bring attention to again is think about everything we just covered is about building the pie, right? That what goes into it, how do we think about those levels, what do we think about ways? We're going to shift and focus instead now on once that has happened, how do we think about the difference in a state and local contribution model from where we are now? I'll start with a little bit of how this works under the BEP, and I do want to take just a moment to address a comment we've heard a lot across the state. For those of you who work in and around the BEP, you will often hear the line said, the BEP is not fully funded. All right, I just want to clarify what I think people are really getting at in that statement. First, under law, we are required to fully fund the BEP. So that part is happening. It would be against the law for us not to. I think the real concern people are surfacing is it enough money to fund all the education needs we have in our communities? And or are the splits of who's putting in what share the right splits between the state and the locals? Okay? Those are the two pieces I think people are really trying to get out of that. And I just want to draw that language differentiation because it'll matter as we kind of get into this conversation a little bit more. So, basic education program, it provides a basic level of funding for education. It includes 47 different components spread across 4 different categories. I want to pause on that one for just a second. We are not looking for a formula that simplifies things to make it easier. There's 47 components in the BEP because there are a lot of factors that influence education. Right? I don't want it to come off that a new formula is just about simplifying. Now, what I can tell you, as someone who's tried to explain this to teachers and to parents before, is that explaining 47 components across 4 categories is a challenge, right? And it does leave a lot of parents feeling like they understand how education finance works. That said, those 47 components are divided across 4 categories, the first of which is instructional salaries. So moving into the second book, when we think about how the state share and the local share is determined, it starts with a basic split. So for instructional salaries, that split is 70-30. For non-classroom components, it's 50-50. The state puts in 50%, locals put in 50%. Right? And that is what the starting point is for every district in the state. That split is then further adjusted for local fiscal capacity. And that is measuring the ability, choosing my word carefully there, the ability of a county to contribute to its education systems. So the way that plays out is that if there is a county that has higher fiscal capacity, that 70-30 split is going to tip, such that the state pays a little bit less and the county pays a little bit more. You may see that go to 65% state, 35% local. For counties who have lower fiscal capacity, you see that split going the inverse direction. The state picks up a little bit more, maybe 75%, and the county picks up a little bit less, 25%. We're going to talk a little bit more about local capacity in a moment. But the piece that I want to push on and just make sure it gets embedded in everyone's mind is that is the biggest shift to try to capture the differences between each county to contribute to their local education funds. This is what you all live and breathe every day, so I will not harp on it, but your local sources of funds are primarily property taxes, and then each county will have a different combination or not of other items that may be contributing revenues into the education system. So why don't we circle back to this fiscal capacity piece, because it is really important. While there's a lot of financial models underneath, top line is trying to capture the ability of the county to raise local taxes for education. Second bullet is important. It's not based on what is actually raised. It is based on the ability to. So if you have a county who comes in and gets a new property tax assessment and the values of the property all go up, that's what's considered a fiscal capacity, not whether or not the county actually raised taxes and produced more revenues as a result. I want everyone to hear that, as this is where we are starting from. The formula determines each county's ability based on average rates across the state. It's a relative measure, right? So again, at a whole, we're still going back to that 70-30 split, but it's about how do we tweak it relative for each county such that that's where it comes out at the end. It's determined at a county level, not an individual district level. So we have a lot of multi-system counties, whether that's a city school district, a special school district, or some other nuance. Fiscal capacity is only calculated at the county level. And the BEP formula currently uses two different calculations to do it. One from TASER, which is a state entity, and one from CBER, which is based out of UT Knoxville. Those are two different calculations of fiscal capacity that are then combined to come up with the number that we use. Again, two sources of expert lenses on it to come up with the number that ultimately goes into the formula. So what do you get out of all of this, right? There are two numbers that your finance directors, your finance leads in your county commission space will know. The formula generates this first one, the local required match. So after we do all that math, right, the 70-30 split or whatever it may be, and further adjust for fiscal capacity, it produces two different numbers. First, here's the amount the state is going to contribute. Second, here's what the county is expected to contribute. That is the local required match number. Okay. The second number is maintenance of effort. This is handled in a totally different part of state law, right? Totally different section from school finance. And what the maintenance of effort requirement says is that each county must put the same amount into their education systems this year as they did last year over year, right? There are some exceptions there. We have declining enrollment where that can be adjusted, but maintenance of effort is a big piece of this. So for some of our counties, they are right, those two numbers are right side by side, right? For many of our counties across the state, county commissions and funding bodies are putting in more money above that local required match, and that's what's driving the maintenance of effort level. And pull this all back together. As I said from the start, it's really hard to have conversations about what a new split may look like, what fiscal capacity could look like adjusted, if you don't know what the full formula looks like, and how your community is going to fare in it. How much money are we talking about? What does the formula do in terms of my community? So this is where we're starting based on the feedback we've heard today. And this is what we need your input and feedback on, is this proposal. First, we want to say develop the right state formula, right? There is a political appetite at the state level. There is a financial opportunity at the state level to dig in and have this conversation. More important than all of that, there's an urgency to get more money for our kids in schools, right? So there is urgency to move on building this formula piece now. What we're proposing here is to say, from the time when and if a General Assembly passes a new formula, let's take 1 year to dig into this local contribution conversation. Let's look at how the numbers play out for your communities. Let's evaluate all of the things, the factors that go into it. We heard great feedback about these other grants flowing into the formula, right? That simplifies a lot, but some of those grants already require a match component. Some of them do not, right? If you put in something that didn't require a match into the formula that now requires a match, it tracks that you'd want to revisit how that match operates, right? So let's take a year to really dig into that conversation, understand what happens now, what could be different, and make a decision on whether or not something should be different or not. What would that mean? This is kind of that summary point. Local districts may see more state funding in a new formula, but communities would not have to contribute anything additional for at least 5 years. And the proposal here is to break that out into 2 chunks. Take 1 year to have this meaty conversation with the numbers in hand, and then give ourselves up to 4 years beyond that to actually implement. So I have no projections about what 1 year in discussing this could turn into, right? It could leave the split exactly like it operates now. It could change and alter it altogether, right? But what I do know is even if the raw dollar figures don't change that a local is having to grapple with, it is a shift in budgeting practices. And there could be other implications. That takes time to implement and execute well. So let's take that potentially up to 4-year runway for local implementation to happen. Before I turn it over for discussion, one of the things that I want to encourage groups to discuss today is to try to focus your thoughts and attention on this local contribution piece. We are open and willing and want to hear from you about the funding formula, but one of the unique things about the body of people sitting in this room is that you all are the only ones who put your hands on this local contribution piece, right? You are the groups who work together to make that part happen. So as Eve comes back up to facilitate that, I just want to make sure that that is where the bulk of the attention is focused. Before I do that, are there any questions I can answer? And I will just go ahead and disclaim at the beginning. If it sounds like the question may be better surfaced to one of Eve's discussion points, I may just push you into that chunk of the agenda here. If anything I can answer about how local contribution works now or the starting point proposal? All right. Oh, Eve.
Thank you, Sam. And as he just described, a lot of foundational information that we hope will help inform the discussions that you will have in your groups. And so really the focus of the next bulk of time is to say, if we take this 12 months, if we have the deeper discussion, if we have the number, the amount, and we get together and have more of a work session so we look at models and what could happen, what information would be needed to do that. And so really, this is the first discussion question, because, I mean, as Sam pointed out, if this were easy, it would have been done a long time ago. This is clearly, complex on the state level, on the local level as well. And so when we give you all that time in just a moment, I want you to get with your team from your district, and if you're here by yourself or a couple of you want to circle up with others, feel free to do that. But what we ask is this: if we take this extended period of time to dig deeply and to really look at the implications of different options and models of that state and local contribution split, what information would you need? And kind of focusing in on 3 things. Number 1, as a leader, knowing that you will be working with your stakeholders on this, what information, what are the 3 things that no matter what else you get, you have to have that information to feel informed, to have the right information in front of you. That could be facts, that could be numbers. It could also be other data. We heard in some of our earlier sessions like that, I think it would be helpful to see the current model side by side with the proposed model. I would maybe want to see something statewide or from another state or a southern state or whatever. Thinking about what information you would need, what data you would need to feel informed to have that discussion. Because clearly this is the first of other engagements to come. This is just the tip of the sword here that we know requires and will need additional conversation. So top 3 things you would need to know: what data you would like to see to feel informed, to feel like you can provide input and recommendations on this. And the 3rd item there would be information on any topics. Sam just walked through at a high level the Tasser-Sieber 50-50 model that we currently use. In our earlier sessions, someone said, I know nothing. I know those words, but I do not know what does Tasser attempt to measure and what does Sieber attempt to measure. And so maybe that's an example of a topic that you feel would be beneficial to ground your conversations in with your stakeholders. And because here's the thing, if we take this period of time to do this and do this well, we want to make sure that when we reconvene and we have that information, that we come back to this group with what is needed. so that we are making the most of the time. Time is really hard to get, especially getting groups together that are incredibly busy. And so I want you to think about that. And in terms of timeline, we know right now the subcommittees are working regularly on, as Sam said, building the pie. And so if that work will continue, of course, to the end of this year, early January, and maybe by late January, we have more information about a proposal. Once we get that, we will begin to bring this group back together. If they come up with a proposal that gets presented to the General Assembly and passed. So those are the items that we want you to work within your teams, and then we are going to share out so that we can capture your feedback. But it's also helpful for others to hear. It certainly has prompted other questions, hearing the feedback from other counties that are either in your vicinity, likeness and size, or demographics. So 3 things here. We're going to take probably 20, 25 minutes to do that. Before we break, I'll say one other thing. Within those discussions, if you all have other considerations that should be elevated. I'll give one example. I think someone said, cost of living should be embedded more in the formula. I know there's an inflation component, but is it sufficient? Cost of living being one of the ones that was flagged earlier. So if there are other considerations that need to be elevated, be sure to flag those as well. Any questions on the ask? All right, we'll take probably 25 minutes, although the discussions seem to be a little longer than that, but we'll work around the room and reconvene here shortly. So with that, I'll let you circle up with your groups. What feedback they have on these three items.
I'm Stovall, I'm from the Charter Commission, so I fully acknowledge we have a unique perspective, but I think one thing that we thought about and talked a lot about, particularly because we get funding from multiple geographic areas, so we have a really interesting perspective on different local communities and how they do the local match, is transparency around the local component, specifically the mechanics of that. Both for schools' perspectives, but also the regular stakeholder. We talked a lot about could a school leader explain how formula works. Considerations we're thinking about and what are the updates / true-ups / timelines around both the local component and then the formula in general. So what student cohort is being used? How does that impact if a district has a year of growth compared to their 12th grade year that's left? What does that look like?
That's a good point.
And then finally, and this is, I know this is the part, 25, but I would love and call for the department to think about the E-plan mechanism of reporting the state funds budget, revenues, and the final expenditures reporting. And is there an opportunity to improve / think about the transparency of that process such that stakeholders can really see both the front and the back?
Yes, I think that's great feedback, yes, because that is the state's grants management system, and when we think about transparency, making sure that it is a public system, but you do have to have a level of understanding on how to navigate it. I think that's a great flag, as well as the kind of the comment about the timeline. We have heard that if this is really going to be something that's student-based, what happens when your students change year to year? I appreciate those very much.
I joined with it.
Okay.
Okay, nobody else has made it. I'll say Our first concern that I've voiced multiple times is that if there is a window of time where counties don't have to invest funds, it could be interpreted as we won't invest funds for 4 years. And so by putting that window of allowing counties time to prepare for the new state investment, that it could lead to no investment from our local funding bodies during that time period. We also have concerns about understanding the new formula, asking our local funding bodies to sign a contract that the state passes when they don't know how much they're being asked to put in. And that's not good business sense, because if we're telling them it's been passed, and hey, in 5 years you get to have to put this money in, how much, we don't know. And that's scary, and is one of those things as we look at, we worry about the speed at which it's moving while not having the money there. We all are here for kids. We know that as 100%, but as we look at kids, we also teach kids to think logically and to examine and to look at it. We believe that our county commissioners and leaders don't have a good understanding, and possibly we don't have a good understanding of the BEP, and any new state funding that comes has to have better communication and training about it, but we also have to look at making sure the Sunshine Law is held up, because if you get multiple commissioners in the same room, multiple school board people in the same room, it is now possibly considered not an open meeting. Other things I missed?
Thank you for sharing those, and some of that are things that we've heard as well mentioned. I also know that we heard in the session this morning, thinking about that 5-year versus say, nothing for 5 years, but thinking about more of a graduated model to keep them engaged, and to your point. I think those are very valid points, and appreciate the feedback. How about this?
We really just center our discussions on, we need more information on what nuts and bolts make up the components of this building phase.
Back there.
So we're Rutherford County and Clarksville, Montgomery together, and we also agree that there needs to be more communication, more understanding of what the BEP is for our commission and our county and all of those different groups. Also, one of the things concerned about is cost of living, making sure that's a part of this, because we mentioned that we have several teachers that live in the system that may have purchased their home years ago, it was 100,000 and now it's 400,000 and having to be able to afford that. So cost of living, also a dedicated revenue stream for growth, because both of these counties are experiencing great growth. Then looking at also paying for the maintenance of existing schools. We've been saved this year because of COVID and all those funds, but that's going to go away. But having the funds to pay for the maintenance of existing schools. So those are kind of our top ones that I understand. Anything else, guys?
Wonderful. Thank you all for that feedback. I definitely will include that. I know we've heard cost of living several times as well. But thinking about, we know about this deferred maintenance situation as well, and I do think that's one of the things that is pretty consistently this whole. Over here.
Well, we appreciate you providing the opportunity for all of us to meet, and we have a good cross-section of people in different roles. We get some good input. We felt that and as you mentioned, we agreed that we felt there needed a side-by-side comparison, a very structured side-by-side comparison of the formulas and components, where people can make an informed decision about the side-by-side. That we felt that was crucial. And then we also felt, like most folks or most districts, we'd like to know the local impact. We mentioned 5 years or a whole harmless 5 years, or not whole harmless, but you get the same. We get less money in a year to dig into it. We felt that was important to know what that meant as far as local contribution. And that's a serious issue, very, very serious issue. We also felt and talked about and had some good input. Does this mean dollars stay, or the student-centered philosophy? Does that mean that it stays in public education? Does that pie feed public education? And we're concerned, we want the pie to feed public education. We don't want everybody around to have their hand in pie just for public education. That's just being honest. And we also had a question, we're doing a fourth bonus for you. We felt that, you talked about performance outcomes. Is that award centered or is that punitive? Is that tied into teacher licensure and evaluation? How are those performance outcomes viewed at the state level when you start talking about performance outcomes? When you talk about district award, school award, teacher award, what are you talking about, and what does it mean? Is it tied in with evaluation, teacher evaluation?
Oh, very good feedback. I'm going to clarify a couple of things just to put it out there. This conversation is about a public funding formula. It is about funding public education in Tennessee. And when we talk about the money following the student, just to be clear, the BC has always followed the student. A student who moves from District A to District B.
I understand that. What I'm asking is, if a student goes to our district or Montgomery County or Rutherford County,
it does not follow them to price.
That's all I need to know. Now, we don't take. Is this being videoed?
Yes.
I don't want to have to fight the state. Okay. Thank you.
The other thing that you mentioned about the performance outcomes, everything that I have heard, and again, that's just where the conversation is right now, as Sam pointed out, that is just the current state of feedback. I have not heard that to be punitive at all.
Okay.
What I think you make a really good point about is clarifying district level, school level,
yes,
teacher level, student level. I think that's a great flag, and I appreciate you mentioning that as well. In the back.
Listen, County, a lot of what I've heard you talk about. Speaking on the growth factor, I'm gonna tell you these high growth areas we went through. We're dealing with new students, new families every day, trying to fill school. 5 years, we're gonna be behind the ball and have a lot of issues. So 5 years, that's the one thing I take back. In these high growth areas, we can't wait 5 years to figure out how we're gonna fund our schools when we meet our needs. And also, we're just gonna be real, we gotta know.
Sure.
It's hard to make a decision. It's hard to even have these discussions. We don't know what formula is. We don't know. I will tell you as a public administrator, if we're not getting more money, it's gonna be hard for us to support and get buy-in, it's gonna take this thing off. We need to know what that is up front. Teacher pay has got to be addressed. It's the number one thing. We're all in a crisis right now, and I've got teachers quitting and going to work at Amazon because they make more money for their family to try to pay and live in these communities. And that's got to be a part of it. I know that's really growth, but that's the nuts and bolts that we're dealing with. Thank you for this opportunity. I think it's great, but I'm telling you, we don't have 5 years to wait.
I appreciate that, and I also would just echo the fact that, we know that in a perfect world, we would have that number right today. My hope is that we have more information to inform our next discussion on this, because certainly this is not a one and done moment. And also, I would just say, I appreciate the flag on high growth. We heard that in other parts of the state. And all of this is grounded in more state dollars going into education. Like that is kind of the assumption we all start with, is that we're not doing this for a smaller pot of money. We are revisiting this formula because we all feel strongly that we need to fund education more. So I appreciate that, but I want you to know that that is something that we are taking as a starting point.
And I just think that whole marvelous sounds good, but for some commissioners, they're gonna take that as we're held hostage.
Really strong flag though, because I think obviously what we don't want to create is some kind of disincentive for public funding or local funding to either stop or stay flat. So I do think the way in which we talk about that and the way in which we structure, because when we were talking about this on-ramp, this long-term ramp, what we're trying to do is in places, we know at the end of this, that the local contribution could look different. It could impact, so we're trying to give enough of a runway to be able to make those adjustments. But to your point, it's very important for us to think through carefully how we talk about it, but also how we implement. I really appreciate this.
Williamson County, the top things we need to know, and some of these are repeat. What is the basic amount for each student? What is the sped tiered approach? What is the growth factor? And how will CTE, what will happen with CTE? And then as people are talking, I just wrote down, there's an opportunity here, I think, to look at this process through the lens of teacher and teacher assistant shortages and making that a real priority in this process. What can we do to address some of those things? Data points that might be helpful include the BEP funding versus what is funded locally, and then local funding amounts and sources, that transparency that's been mentioned. And then finally, info sessions on key topics. One of the things that we all pretty agreed on was that we feel like, and this process is still evolving, so an overall picture of your project plan about this process, a timeline. For example, hearing about the 1 year discussion and then 4 years, that was new to all of us today. And even if it's not new information, just having your project plan posted somewhere so that we can reacclimate ourselves to it every time we come to one of these would be really helpful. And then also funding for nurses and positions like that, standard across the board, re-looking at that standard that requires in some places, a nurse to drive back and forth to 2 different schools. That's unsustainable. So I think Roger should have something else as well.
Well, I'm gonna come back from the elected side, but most everybody in here is school side. But allow under, I think you can do this, but it takes some change, but ask permission for the look at the maintenance of effort for credit that these high growth counties, like have been mentioned here, can get credit for that as an offset without having to regulation maintenance of effort, which will help the county commissioners to see that. So we're putting in $70 million, 60, whatever the math was, 60 or $70 million. I start in the hole just by funding over over BEP positions to keep our classroom sizes down. I'm sure that's even higher than that. But when you're held to that standard, and then, I mean, right out of the gate, I've got to go to the county commissioners, to the mayor, and say, this is where we start. We're 600 teachers. Well, every school system has teachers in that they're paying beyond the BEP formula, which gives you the heartache up on the hill, because they're being told they're funding the BEP at 100%, and they are, but they don't understand the maintenance of effort. They don't understand your area of salary adjustments versus what is actually happening. You just go back over the maintenance of effort to get you some flexibility over there.
I appreciate that, and I think that those will be some of the things we'll take back and look at kind of categorically what do we need to talk about in these follow-up meetings. And I think maintenance of effort is one we have heard. As Sam said, it's not part of the BPs and a separate part of the law, but I can tell you that it is certainly something that we are looking at, how a change in the funding model and what else is impacted in Title 49 of the code. So certainly appreciate that, and will be something we will tackle going forward. Appreciate that.
You were there. I will tell you that most of the things that have already been mentioned, we talked about as well. I don't think there's a whole lot of people in this room, with the exception of you, that understands the whole business capacity. Because I know it too. And I think that's the number one thing. You know, we've got websites now for everything. And I don't know, I'd rather talk to the later to find out what any branch of this can, as opposed to whatever the case may be. And if it wasn't for the superintendent group, I probably would a lot of other things. But one of the things we talked about was we like the idea of the fact that all the grants that we have to apply for would be one of these. But you're still looking at ratios. As you know, we got a lot of counties out there that saw the need for SROs before anybody else. So then we have a grant that takes 1/5 of what we pay for SROs. So those county commissioners who saw that as the need, we're getting from the get-go, because all of a sudden they, take for instance, you know, last year we got a grant. If you didn't have an SRO, we'd get you one. You know, we'd pay for one. Well, if we got one, then we didn't, you know, we don't qualify for grant. So those kind of things. Another thing that we did talk about was BEP, of course, lags behind, as we all know. We're getting money for kids that we had last year, not the ones that we have this year. And so the ability to I guess, change on the dime, when you do have a school that has, you know, 800 kids, that they didn't have, you know, before, well, you'll get growth money in February, you know, then a little bit late for that. So those kind of conversations. And then, last thing that we did talk about, we haven't talked about this whole time, but, you know, you give me an update on the talk, where's the mental health need for our kids, community form? Whether it be, we talk about counselors, but right now we form counselors for a number of children, when in reality, if you've got a high school of 500 kids, each grade level has different needs, as opposed to, you know, funding one counselor for 500 kids is almost a travesty. So, just, we're dealing with ratios, even at that bottom part of the pyramid, but I do think that we should talk about these are
I appreciate that. I appreciate you flagging those things, the mental health, and thinking about how that's represented is certainly feedback that we have heard, and I'm included here as well. But I think we all understand that we are facing situations, issues with students that they have needs we just didn't have. Certainly, not 30 years ago, not 10 years ago. Today, we are certainly having this moment that we're gonna revisit. Let's make sure that we are addressing the needs.
Behavior, we talk PCDS, all of those things.
Thank you.
International.
Chris Ensign, CFO for Medical National. We had a very robust discussion. The top three things, I guess, the first would be the fiscal capacity. looking at as far as your ability to fund education, but also what additional needs do you have as a county? Not just looking solely at the, for instance, the assessed property values and the local option sales tax base. You know, what are the additional needs that, for instance, in our case, an urban county would have, where other local revenues need to go to meet those other needs? Secondly, the second equity adjustment, I guess, would be some type of cost of living. I know this was mentioned before, but taking into consideration cost of housing. You know, we want our employees to be able to live in the same county where they work. Currently, they can't because of the cost of housing, cost of living, just cost of doing business. It's different from county to county. And so if you have a fiscal capacity on a countywide basis across the state, there needs to be something that takes into consideration on the other end of the spectrum, the higher cost of living, higher cost of housing, et cetera. And then thirdly, federal law, of course, requires us to educate all students, whether they're documented or undocumented. And currently, undocumented students typically aren't picked up in the economically disadvantaged component because they don't qualify for SNAP benefits or direct certifications because they're undocumented. And yet we are glad to serve them, but we're not getting any credit for those students as far as the economically disadvantaged component goes. And then regarding just EL in general, you know, there's a big difference between a school district that may have some EL students and they all speak Spanish. We have over 140 languages spoken in Davidson County schools. And so there needs to be some kind of differentiation regarding the English learner component or weight, as it were, in the new student-centered formula. And then lastly, we saw something up there that we haven't heard much about, the charter school weight. What does that mean? Of course, that's not going to apply to every county, but you know, what does that even mean? What kind of weight for a charter school are we even talking about?
Sure.
And we would welcome, of course, you to have a meeting like this in Davidson County as well. We appreciate it.
Appreciate that. I will say what little I've heard about the charter piece, just to close the loop on that, is right now charter schools receive the average ADM, and so I think that's been some of the feedback, is knowing that districts may do other types of initiatives from the district level that they may not get. That's what little I've heard. However, I've not been in all of those conversations. The subcommittees would have all of that specific feedback. It's just the feedback I've had. Yes, sir.
And following on Ryder as sort of an election here, this is the general point, but don't come up with a formula that rewards anybody for not doing their part. But if you're going to go through the whole fiscal capacity drama, then don't reward and make up the money that they're not doing. You have to encourage people to do their part. Of course, we think we do an inchful, but that's just a good impulse. Don't reward anybody for not doing their part by making it up. You don't have to. We'll make it up. And in our case, we overfund, but don't really get credit for it either. So our taxpayers end up subsidizing people who are not doing their share. Is what it seems like, and that seems unfair. So as you go back to the general redesign, this is the moment to design it more.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. I know that there's a couple other folks in the back. Did we get everything?
I just wanted to ask a question. What is the timeline for presenting this information to the legislature?
So again, my understanding of where it is right now is the subcommittees are continuing that work right now through December, through January. Clearly with the session beginning in early 2022, the subcommittees would put forward the proposal to the steering committee, again, made up of legislators, governor, others, commissioner. That would probably happen late January, early February of 2022, and then they would determine whether they are going to take that to the full general assembly. So that would happen during the spring of 2022.
So I would just like to ask, and I'm sure I've got some colleagues here that would agree, that whatever you take before them, that we get to see a draft of it first before it goes to them, so that we're not surprised when they get something and we have no knowledge of it, and then they're voting on it, and we didn't have it. So whatever the draft is, that we get to see it first before they get to see it.
Absolutely, and that is consistent feedback we're hearing as well.
I have two things.
Yes, sir.
You're doing a great job giving us the message. We're just trying to work on nuts and bolts. Speaking of this, what was just mentioned, I know you've probably gotten asked this several times. why is there such a sense of urgency to do something so important?
Right now, in terms of building the.
And why is there this environment
Sure.
of urgency?
Well, I think.
To deal with something so complicated.
So I would say a couple of things. One, we have a governor and a general assembly that has the will to take on this very important job that hasn't been done in 30 years fully. So there's that. There's also opportunity financially to put more money into education. And so our role today and right now, as the subcommittees are meeting regularly, is to capitalize on the will and the opportunity. Because, I mean, I don't want us to sit here and look back 6 months from now when we see another agency get funded differently and we miss that opportunity.
So when you see
So
some
I would say
government
that.
legislators are dying to get more money,
Education continues to be a priority for the governor. There is a very serious interest in continuing to prioritize.
another thing I'll shut up. The last meeting, the commissioners had mentioned, or there had been some discussion about DEP as a component, is a categorical component-driven formula, and there are thresholds, and Mr. Causey mentioned ratios. So we were under the impression that thresholds may be risen towards grade level, classroom max. In other words, more students may be able, the ratios may rise, and you may be able to put more students in the classroom. Is that in the works?
Honestly, I haven't heard that.
Because that's not a good thing.
Well, I haven't even heard that mentioned. I know that
We didn't
class
mention it at the last meeting.
size requirements
That's not required.
are in a different part of the law. And I don't, to my knowledge, that is not something that I'm hearing, but I defer to my colleagues if they have other information, but that's
You just
not.
want to take that to whoever.
Sure,
if
happy to do that.
That's a concern.
I would agree.
Classroom max shouldn't be.
And I do know that, some of the feedback we're getting are, as Sam had on his slide, those lower class sizes for K2. We've also heard of things that are specific to middle grades and high schools specifically, so, but that's not one that I would actually. Yes, sir.
Is there a reason you talk about adding adult high school? Because a lot of counties in the state that have an adult high school are truly funding that level. I mean, there's no state funding for that. So,
I haven't heard it mentioned here.
These are 22-year-olds, 25, 65-year-olds who are making the point to come back to get their high school diploma, as opposed to their SAT. And right now, the local folks are taking the brunt of that, and I think it needs to be part of the plan.
And I do know that things like the there's adult high school, adult education potentially, but I think that's a really good flag as something to kind of investigate what's happening. Is there any conversation between adult education and K-12? Appreciate that.
And just a couple of, when the discussion comes about the standards of living.
Yep.
Also living, that works both ways.
Sure.
So when we do, we're very small, very rural, but when we do human capital analysis, the lack of housing and the lack to provide housing is a struggle for us to even find employees. So they drive from other districts to work in our schools. So if that cost of living works both ways, they may live somewhere where they're not working. In fact, about 75% of Hickory County have people that live there don't work. They have to drive out of the county. So that, just know that goes both ways.
Sure.
Scarcity.
Absolutely.
Which is something I'm very passionate about. But my second question is about accountability for local funding bodies who do not meet this obligation. Because right now, you can say your sales tax is going to be here, but if it doesn't come in as it was budgeted, the retribution falls to the school system. So has there been discussion of what that accountability piece looks like if in 5 years the local funding bodies don't do their part?
So I think that continues to be a topic of discussion. I know like the required fund balance is intended to absorb that moment when it doesn't come in. But I think it's a really good flag as just something to think about as we're putting this into more of a model and saying, what does the next 5 years look like? Knowing that if we're just saying it is 5, that again, you're going to have a local contribution component that may look different than it looks right now. And until we get amounts and we can actually run those models, but I would flag that as just something that needs to be continued to talk about is in the example that you just gave on sales tax, making sure that we're also thinking about what happens if it doesn't.
Yeah, because what can happen is that you didn't get your revenue, and then you lost your fund balance. So you really paid, the school system paid twice.
I think the takeaway from my colleague here is it's differentiation across. You got suburban, you got urban, and we all have our different challenges. You know, I'll say with our county commission, they fund a lot of the DEP, and it's not just teachers, it's administrative positions that you have to have, and like the mayor said, it's a burden on them. But what I'm saying is, as we look at this, we need to keep a focus on that there's differences across the state.
Without a doubt. And I think that's one of the things, you know, as we've met groups all week, we have here, it's been in every region of the state where you have the larger districts, the suburban districts, and then you literally have the district that has one school, and those are very different challenges, clearly. We have, as Sam noted, the rural versus scarcity, and when you go into those counties, and again, they're 60 miles apart, that creates a very different challenge than it does from a resource standpoint. So I flag that and think that is part of what they're trying to do is make sure that we're thinking about the differences across our state and trying to,
and especially when your outcomes are all based on your EPSOs, your project-based learning, when you don't have those opportunities in your border and you're having to try to find that, we don't have TCAT, we don't have industry, we don't have college.
So to that point, what could some other metrics or outcome metrics be?
I like the metrics, we just need to have support.
Amen.
Knowing that, because we want our kids to compete. So we just need to have support in how to make that happen.
I appreciate that and agree. And I also think, you know, we should continue to think about what could an outcome metric be for an elementary. And because all of those certainly will go secondary. That's something to consider. I know we're getting close on time. You all have flagged some of those considerations, especially cost of living. Taking this long period of time to do this thoughtfully and well, we're trying to also think through what that structure could look like. This is an amazing group to bring different perspectives to this discussion. And so are there others that should be part of that we haven't included here? What should the cadence of be? So this is some of the things, just a point about the project plan. This is part of what we will be developing to do this well and with the appropriate stakeholders. So more to come on that. I would say this, as you leave here today and you go back and you think more about it, or you have conversations with colleagues who are not here today, continue to get feedback, continue to ask for things that you didn't hear today, or if they surface something, and please share that feedback with us. There will be, I'm going to put the QR code, by the way, back up for folks who came in late. That is how we will send out the PowerPoint. There's like 3 questions, also gives you a chance to give feedback that maybe you didn't want to share in a large group. But I would also say this, as you think about sharing additional feedback, I will summarize, Sam will summarize, Tree's been taking notes as well. But when we talk about what matters to the subcommittees, what matters is hearing your local context. That matters to legislators, that matters. And if you can describe that in ways that I never could or could do it justice. So I would encourage you to take this opportunity to provide this feedback to us and to these subcommittees. It comes in, it gets coded, and it gets sent immediately to the subcommittee. So please take this opportunity to do that. And as I shared, this is the first of what obviously is a larger, longer conversation. On behalf of my colleagues, I would say thank you for being here at this incredibly busy time. I appreciate the feedback and wish you all a very Merry Christmas and safe travels home. But look forward to engaging as we move this way. Thank you.